Hi friends, today we get to hear from Mandy Algate all about cooperative learning in elementary music. This was such an informative conversation and Mandy was so generous to share from her knowledge and expertise about cooperative learning. One of the things that I loved in talking to Mandy, along with just her presence in general, was how granular she got with her examples so that we can start to implement some of these best practices as soon as school starts up again. Mandy's bio is in the show notes, which you can access with the link either in your podcast player or in the YouTube description if you're watching our conversation on YouTube. You can also find her contact information there if you want to send her a quick thank you note. And with that, let's hear from Mandy. My name is Victoria Bowler, and this is episode 82 of Elemental Conversations. Mandy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Great. I think I told you via email that I spent your Oak session sitting at an airport, wishing I could be there. So I'm really glad.
It's the worst when that happens. I'm sorry.
So I'm glad that you made the time to give me a special, one-on-one session, which is probably even better. Mandy, can you talk to me about cooperative learning? And can you just help us frame our thinking around this? Like if we've heard cooperative learning and collaborative learning and group work, can you help us kind of get maybe some of our vocabulary down? So thinking about what cooperative learning is and how we might use it in our classrooms.
Sure. So cooperative learning from the way that I think about it is a lot of times it happens in small groups, but not always. It can be in pairs. It can even happen in a whole group setting where children are mixing and mingling with other children in the class. I always start with the work of Drs. Spencer and Michael Kagan. They kind of pioneered this type of learning they were using kind of the perspective of a core classroom, but they developed an acronym for PIES, which is when I'm working to develop or implement a cooperative structure, that's the way that I would check to make sure that it is in fact cooperative. So the P in PIES stands for positive interdependence. So if you're designing an activity that you want to be cooperative, you have to have first and foremost positive interdependence, which just refers to like all of the children in the group, all of the learners are actually willing to work together. I for individual accountability. So all the participants play a unique role. Everybody has a job and all the jobs are different. With that in mind, E in PIES stands for equal participation, which means that each role that is given is equally important and has kind of an equal amount of rigor. And then S in PIES stands for simultaneous interaction. So the roles within a cooperative structure can't be completed in isolation. The children or the learners have to be continuously interacting with each other. And that kind of helps you avoid that classic scenario where like one person does all the work and the rest of the people go, sounds good. So these types of structures have a lot of interaction. And while the teacher serves as the facilitator of the roles, it is mostly the interaction between the children that is leading to the learning.
That's great. That's great. Mandy, I'm curious about when you got interested, or maybe how you got interested in cooperative learning, and maybe even what your lessons kind of look like, how they're different now that you have this, obviously a big emphasis in this area.
Sure. I got interested in this. I was sort of led to it by a district initiative that, like many, were taken on through the lens of a core classroom teacher, but it was extended to all classrooms. And I kind of took it as a little bit of a challenge, like let me really try to actually do this. And it took a lot of tweaking. I was asked to use a specific Kagan structure, again, which was developed not for a music classroom. So I had to really do a lot of twisting on that particular structure, but the results that I got were what I was looking for. I have always, I always strive for a student-centered classroom, as most of us, a lot, that's what we do as teachers. But that can be difficult when you don't see your students very consistently, when you have a short amount of time with them, like most music teachers have that kind of situation. But diving into these types of structures allowed my students work to be definitely student centered. It allowed them
Mm.
to take on um, the roles of learning and teaching each other in a way where it empowered them to be able to use what they know, and then to also they could bolster each other's skills because of that equal participation piece. Everybody gets to play a role, no matter, even if kids in the same group weren't necessarily at the same level, they were all able to contribute. And that was something that I really appreciated about that. So from there, I just continued on that journey and was able to start developing my own structures and continue modifying the ones that were developed for core classrooms.
Great, great. And how did your students react when you started, just with that first Kagan structure? How did they react the
Sure.
first time or in the first, year or so?
Sure. So when I first started implementing these, I was working mostly with, I teach pre-K through fifth grade. So I was mostly using them with third, fourth, and fifth graders. They had, in my situation, they had some experience with these types of structures from their core classroom because it was a focus of my campus at the time. So that was helpful. If I were going to start fresh, I think that what I have seen is starting my students at a young age, and then I've been at the same campus for a long time, so I've
Mm,
had that joy of being able to kind of grow with them. The kids that I started using those types of structures at a younger age need less facilitation
mm,
than when I first started implementing these types of structures. So I would say if it's something that someone hasn't done before, to just go ahead and expect that there's going to be bumps along the way, but don't give up. And consider using structures even with your youngest learners, because as they build those skills, you'll see the effects of that as they get older and are able to be even more independent.
mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Mandy. I'm thinking about, how drawn fourth and fifth graders, you said third through fifth. So third through fifth graders are to socializing anyway, right? And so I can imagine taking cooperative learning and wanting to do it with those upper grades just because
Mhm.
that's where they are developmentally. But also, I see your point of if you want to see it in fifth grade, you should start in preschool. Or if
Yes,
you want to see it in fifth grade, start in kindergarten, with whatever is age
right.
appropriate. In the same way that we do with whatever musical skill we want to see in fifth grade,
Yes,
we don't wait
yes.
till fifth grade. We start it earlier.
Yeah. And that being said, also, these types of structures allow for structured independence, which is something that as you get younger and younger, the children have less and less opportunity to make choices and to be independent,
Mm-hmm.
um, just because of the nature of being a younger child. So it does, they appreciate that aspect of it.
Mm, right, right. And then I'm sure that, well, we'll get into this a bit later, I'm sure, but like your kindergarten structures are going to look very different, or they're going to be facilitated differently from your fourth grade structures. We're using the word structure a lot, and we're using
Mhm.
it around all of that research, from the
Sure.
Kagan universe. So can you tell us about these structures and maybe give
Mhm.
us an example of what some of them might look like, maybe in a traditional classroom, and then how
Mhm.
maybe we're adapting them for a general music setting?
Yeah, sure. So when we're talking about structures, we are talking about um, a format for an activity to take place. An example of one that was developed by the Kagans, that I really love to use in my classroom is called Quiz Quiz Trade. In a traditional classroom, that looks like a pair of students, and the way that it's written in the Kagan materials has them using some sort of flashcard situation. So, student A asks the question on the card, student B answers it, and then student A is able to either say, yes, you got it right, or give feedback, and then they switch roles. Um, I like to use that type of structure in a way where And with all of the structures that I'm using, I really try to connect it to the repertoire in some sort
Mm,
of way so that we're not having to stop music making in order to participate in a structure.
mm,
So in my classroom, I use quiz quiz trade in a lot of different ways. But an example would be with my first graders. My first graders really enjoy Ickle, Ockle, which is a song that lots of people use, and we play the game first of all and don't connect it to the structure. I think that it's important that they experience that part of the learning. So once they've got a really good handle on the repertoire, then I can lay the structure and layer it on top. So the way
mhm,
that the structure works connected to Ickle is I have cards with like with I would use it to practice the element rest, quarter rest. So I could have rhythm cards. Mine are shaped like fish because we're using a fish themed song. The kids move through the classroom just like they would play the game, singing the song. At the end, the game has them pair with each other. So just like that, they pair. And then student A taps their rhythm into student B's hand, and then student B says the rhythm back. So they could tap ta
mm.
ta ti ti ta, and then student B would feel it in their hand and say it back, and student A has a chance to correct or acknowledge that it was correct by reading the card to student B. Then there's an opportunity for B to do the same with their cards. So the structure happens again with switched roles, and then they switch cards. So now they've had a chance to become an expert at a new card, and they're going to swim off and pair with someone different and share that knowledge with a new partner at the
That's
end.
beautiful. I love that. I love that. Very quickly, for anyone listening and they don't know Ickle Ockle, they don't know the magic of this song and game, can you teach us Ickle Ockle really quickly?
Sure. And this is one of those where there's 1,000 different versions, but here's the version I use. Ickle, ockle, blue bottle fishes in the sea. If you want a partner, just choose me. So I do this as a free movement game. So the students are stepping to the beat as they sing. It's a scattered formation and they get to move as long as the song is happening. At the end, when the song says, just choose me, they stand back to back with another person, and that is their partner.
Great. Great. Okay, that's fabulous. In the many different, like you said, the many different games, the variant that I'm using most often is we're walking around in a circle, and then at the
Mhm.
end of the song, you need to find a partner, but it can't be your immediate neighbor. It can't be the person
Yeah,
whose shoulders are right next to you. So lots of
right.
different versions of that. I haven't tried the open space one, but I think I will now
Yeah,
because that sounds delightful.
it's really fun. I also sometimes will throw in, instead of just a partner, I'll call out trio, quartet, quintet, and they have to make different
Hmm.
sizes. But again, that would be separate from that structure, but just another way to use that song.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we have the song and the game, and then everybody has a card. We pair
Mhm,
up with someone, and then we have this rhythm identification, and it's
mhm.
a check, one way to use the quiz trade. That's a great adaptation of that structure. Do you have any others that you find are your go-tos?
Sure. I have another one that I use with upper grades when my students are practicing fa. I use the song Early in the Morning, which goes, early in the morning at 8 o'clock, you can hear the postman knock. Up jumps Ella to open the door. One letter, two letter, three letter, four. All right, so I have my students sit in groups of four in a line. I give them cards with the notation for the song. Um, and I use stick notation for this one, but you could use staff notation if that's where your students are sitting, if that's what they need practice with. The cards are mixed up, and mine happen to look like postcards because it goes with the theme of the song again.
Hmm.
The I will sing on a neutral syllable um, the first measure of the song. So just do 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 do. The first person in the line has the job of finding the card with that melody on
Mm,
it. So they find it, then they hand it to the next person. That person's job is to check that it's correct. The third person's job is to place the card in the right place because the goal is to get the
mm,
cards all in the right order. So they place the card on like the first square, number one. And then the last person's job is to signal to me that the group is ready. And so I have them hold up a little flag like on a mailbox, right?
Cute.
Okay, so once the flags are up, I can check and make sure everybody's on the right track, right? So I'm still
Mm-hmm.
facilitating, but the kids are doing everything else. Once I've made sure everybody's right, we sing it in solfege, that card that they found, and then A moves to the last slot and everybody scoots up. So that way, since there's four measures in the song and there's four
Mm.
kids working on the structure, everybody gets to do every single job. And that's something that's recurring. We want everybody to have a chance to do all of the different roles because they're all different and serve a
Mm.
different objective.
Right, right. And that's going back to your pies, what you taught us at
Sure.
the very beginning, just making sure that when we're adapting these structures or creating our own or whatever it is, that we're thinking through what role everyone has in the collective ensemble that we're kind of making into this like little chamber cooperative
Yes.
group.
Yeah, and then how can you ensure that every learner gets a chance at every role?
Mm, great, great. Okay,
And
there's a
there's
lot
usually
to,
some sort of there's usually
yeah,
some sort of rotation or switching of groups or something like that. Like in Ickle Ockle, they switch partners in this early in the morning structure. They're going to switch where they're sitting in the order. So there's
right.
usually some sort of change of materials or partners or
Mhm.
spots. Yeah.
Yeah, so then when I think about the engagement level that I bet you see when you're doing these activities, I bet the engagement level is really high because you're
Yes.
adding so much physical movement even outside of the game, right?
Hmm.
You're adding so much physical movement and you have the manipulatives changing and everything like that. So I can imagine it
Yeah.
would be a really high motivation vibe in the classroom.
Yes, it is. And it is fast paced, but because I want to make sure that it's understood that these are non-competitive always.
Uh-huh.
There's never an element of points or this group against that group. Sometimes I will see classes where they somehow think there's an element like they have to do it faster than the others, and I let that go, but I'm never going to add points. There's
Right.
never a winner. It is cooperative, not competitive.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and that's something that, those, especially those upper grades, are so drawn to the competitive aspect of it. And it's like a one up, one down, everything is a
Mhm.
winner or a loser. And so to kind of shift that framework to again, like we're
Yeah.
an ensemble. Yeah.
Yes, and that's, I was kind of going to talk about when you think about like the highest level of music making that you have had personally,
Mm,
that is almost always when I talk to people about that, it's usually an ensemble situation, and it's almost exclusively a a situation of distributive leadership and not a situation of competition, right?
oof.
Because making music is about connection with other people. So
Mhm.
this is like a way um, to structure your class in a way that leads to distributive leadership rather than a
Mm,
competitive atmosphere. And those competitive, I'm not saying don't use competition in your classroom.
sure.
Those competitive games are so motivating, especially for older students. But I think that there also needs to be space for specific cooperation,
Mhm.
non-competitive activity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me dive in and double click on one aspect that I bet is coming to some people's minds as we listen to this. So let's take this skipping rope song. Let's take the early in the morning activity where everybody has a job and we all have a very specific role that's either, in this case, it's either correct or it's not. It's not an open-ended thing. This is a closed answer thing. If I'm in a group, Mandy, of me and three other friends, and these three other friends are like here in their musical
Mhm.
development as we measure it in our classroom situation, and I'm like way down here.
Sure.
How do you facilitate different? I don't like to use ability, but let's say it mixed.
Differentiation
Yeah, the
within that.
mixed
Yes.
situations. Yeah.
Sure. So I think there's kind of twofold answer here. The first is there, I guess, acknowledging that there are going to be arguments among groups. Um,
Mm,
and I typically will let that happen for a few seconds and see where it goes because more often than not, if they're staying within their role, like they've been taught what the role is and they're maintaining their role, the structure will help them to iron that out. And I think that is an important
mm,
skill to develop. Just, you know, how do you get through a disagreement without the assistance of a facilitator, in this case, the
Mm-hmm.
teacher?
Mm-hmm.
So that is helpful. Um, a lot of times I find that these types of structures are also you can do some self-differentiation within these roles. And then there is opportunity for purposeful differentiation. So going back to the structure with the skipping rope song or early in the morning, um, if I have a student, for example, I will see often on some sort of documentation like an IEP or something
Sure.
that they have a requirement for reduced answer choices, right? I can make the choice to ask that student to sit when we begin the activity to sit in the third or fourth position, because
Mm-hmm.
naturally we're going to have fewer cards for them to choose from as they move closer to their role of being the one who's actually finding the card.
Mm-hmm.
I can also rely on the structure and its supportiveness that's built into it. So if I'm just allowing the students to get into groups of four, and I'm allowing them to just choose an order, just sit in order, in any order. Um, Even if that student who needs a little bit more support ends up in the first position and is choosing from four cards, the rest of the students are in a supportive role in that
Right.
case, and they will assist that student in making a different selection. And they will often tell them, I will see them pointing to the card and saying, this one has a fa here, but that one doesn't. We need this one because I heard it going down, things like that. So then the students that are in the group with that student who needs more support are the ones providing the support. That empowers them and it takes that pressure off of me. Again, it allows the students to self-facilitate.
That's great. When, let me back us up to thinking about how we might apply this. Again, thinking about different, what we'll call different ability levels, but also some developmental differences as well in terms of our upper grades and our lower grades. So, can you walk us through your thought process for choosing activities for, let's start with like lower elementary, like pre K, K, first grade. What are
Sure.
some things that are just like general best practices for you as you're facilitating cooperative learning in these lower grades?
Sure. Well, in lower grades in particular, I think it is particularly important that the students are very, very familiar. If you are connecting a structure to a piece of repertoire, that they are really familiar with that repertoire and have played the game. That if there's a game that goes with it, that they have done multiple activities that lead into your structure, right? So, for example, if you are um, using a structure where your students are identifying some like high and low and they're finding a card that matches it, or they're creating something that matches it, that the students have familiarity with the repertoire that you're using, but they also have some sort of familiarity with the activity that they're completing in, say, a whole group setting before you try to do it in a cooperative setting. For example, when my students were learning the structure for the Ickle Ockle activity, I had them go through a few steps before we did that, layered with the game in its full form. I had the students, I had 5 different rhythms that were swimming around the classroom. So I put those 5 options up on my whiteboard, and I had the students as a whole group, I would tap it and they would identify it. And then another day I had a student come to the board and I had traced my hand onto the whiteboard. And so that student, instead of tapping in their own hand, the leader student was choosing one of the rhythms from the cards and then tapping it onto the whiteboard inside of the hand that was drawn on it, just to lead them toward, okay, it'll make more sense that they're going to tap into a hand if they see it visually on that board, but we're still having a whole group experience. And eventually we can get into that cooperative experience where they're having to be more independent. Yeah.
Yeah, great. I have a very quick interim question and then we'll go to,
Yes.
upper grades. Do you find that you're generally using these structures in practice or
Yes.
are you using them? Okay, that's a yes.
Yes. It's yes. Yeah, almost always practice activity. Yeah, and
Hmm.
and these are late. I'll emphasize these are late practice activities, but the work that you do to lead into the structure can be your early or in mid practice.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so talk us through some of your considerations for upper elementary. What are you thinking about there?
Sure. So, with upper elementary, while I still do, a sequence of build up into a structure, there doesn't need to be quite, I have found they don't need quite as much, which is typical. I also, with my younger students, I will often purposely pair them or group them and I assign them a group. But then with my older students, we know that as students get older, the focus is less on us as the teacher. They still love us, but they are much more socially motivated. And so once I start getting into fourth, fifth grade, especially, I allow them very often to choose their own groups. When we do that, I very specifically teach them how to ask to be in a group and how to invite someone to come to your group. So in my classroom, I tell them you have to make eye contact with someone. You say, "Can I please join your group?" And then they always have like the top number, or if there's a specific number of people that have to be in it. So say they need to have 5 people in their group. So if I come over to you and I say, "Victoria, may I please join your group?" Then you have two options. You can either say, "Yes, of course," with a smile on your face, because it's not welcoming if you're not smiling. Or you can say, and it has to be true, "I'm sorry, we already have 5 people, maybe next time." Um, and we practice that separated from a time when you're actually going to go into an activity. So I take at the beginning of the school year, in the middle of the school year, and toward the end of the school year, there are times when you're going through and practicing those procedures again. And that's one of my procedures that I practice, and just have them practice making groups of different sizes and using that script. And that has been a culture that has been set over several school years within my classroom. But that is, again, how I would set that up anyway, if I were just now coming into something like this. Just making sure that if you're allowing the students to create their own groups, that they have that script. I'm also a proponent that if you have students that historically do not get along in the same class, that either everybody can choose their group and they can be with whoever they want, or the teacher creates every group. Because you don't want to single kids out and say, "Well, you two can't be together." Um, that being said, I have also noticed that when I allow students who outside my classroom are not allowed to work together, that often they come up with some really cool creative answers. You just have to know what you're comfortable with as far as a classroom management perspective there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because when we're used to just hanging out with only our friends, our answers become kind of uniform. We kind of become
Yes.
like in unison with each other. And of course, as musicians, we know that all of our music is not always unison. Sometimes we want things that are complementary. So sometimes
Sure.
I do agree with that. Sometimes getting students out of like a traditional classroom setting and getting them into a situation that feels very different and maybe not as high stakes in terms of like conflict. It can be surprising to everyone that students get along better. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yep.
it's
Great.
really neat to see.
Yep. Um, and then the only other thing that I would yes and to your I have a lot to yes and, but one of the things that is common in a lot of classrooms, I think, is if you say everybody get in a group of 3 or 4, and then everybody has a group except for one person. They're like, no one will be in my group, and you say, well, who have you asked? And they're like, literally no one. I just sat here and
Hmm.
bemoaned the fact that I'm all
Yes.
alone, right? So having that specific script, even though to us it feels like so unnecessary, it is completely necessary.
Right. Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Mandy, when we think about the types of musical tasks that you find yourself drawn to, you mentioned that this is happening in late practice, and so maybe we can talk
Mhm.
about what that means for people who don't have their Kodaly hats on.
Yeah.
So, what does late practice mean and look like? And then, what types of these are two questions. Sorry, I'm throwing a
Mhm.
lot at
No,
you.
that's fine.
What types of activities do you find yourself drawn to for
Hmm.
cooperative learning?
Sure. So when I'm speaking about late practice, I am I'm referring to a time when students are very familiar with a melodic, rhythmic, or metric element, and have had the opportunity to explore it in some um, more basic skill areas. All right. So when we begin practicing an element, often we're looking at reading and identification, those types of skill areas. But as you move further along the continuum of practice, the skill areas become more complex. So you're looking at closer to things where you are taking dictation, where you are composing or improvising. Those are the types of things that we're going to be looking at for a later practice activity where things are more challenging because we have that familiarity with the element that's being worked on. Um, with these types of cooperative structures, most often because they are late practice, and not, they're not, it's not always the case, but most often I'm looking for those upper level skill areas. So I'm looking for things where students are going to have to really apply the skills that they've gained through previous practice activities and then push it a little bit further. Um, an example of, you know, I I think that we as teachers are drawn towards skill areas that we find are more comfortable for ourselves as musicians. So I have, you know, your typical classical training that does not include a lot of improvisation. That is an uncomfortable skill area for me, and I think that a lot of music teachers kind of fall into that. But I have found that these types of structures can be used for that. So, for example, I recently started using an echo song, Frere Jacques. Most people are familiar with that. Um, I used it with my fifth graders. This was one that my older kids were participating in. And I applied a structure to it so to help them to practice improvisation. So I had one student sing the sing a measure in solfege from Frere Jacques. So they might go do, re, mi, do. And then the next student was asked to change one pitch, but keep the rhythm the same. So they might answer do, mi, re, do. And then the next student could continue on in the song. And of course, we switch jobs after that's over. And that allowed my students to do some practicing with a really familiar song with very small changes, right? So it was very structured improvisation. I had a couple of students who thought this was like the coolest thing ever. And so I allowed them, okay, now this time you guys can change two, or you can give them a tone ladder and give them a list of melodic elements that they can choose from. I also had students who found it really, really challenging and were not able to hold that tonal center. So for some of those students, where I was able to give them like a little glockenspiel or some sort of pitched instrument, so that instead of singing it, they would play it back. Um, and then they could change one, and that took a little bit of pressure off, but they were still improvising. So there were a couple of different layers to that one, but they found it really exciting, and it was really fun to watch and see what happened when I gave them that type of activity to complete.
I love that. I love that so much. I bet that just the knowledge that the music is here and we can change it. Like it doesn't always have to be the exact same thing. That's a really, really fun light bulb moment, I'm sure,
Mhm.
for a lot of those students. Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Mandy, a lot of the activities that you're talking about, someone I'm imagining could be listening and thinking, well, that sounds really great, but I can imagine just like handing second graders cards and saying, like, everybody tap the rhythm and just go, right? And you've talked to us a good amount already about scaffolding and giving directions, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about what's going through your brain as you kind of deconstruct an activity from the cooperative learning end result, and then kind of
Hmm.
thinking through like what are those first steps. You've already told us
Sure.
the first step is the song and the game, right? But
Yes.
how do we help students be successful at, this step way down here when there's a
Sure.
lot more independence?
Yes. So I think most importantly, you first have to know where you're headed.
Mm,
So I develop the structure first as the end goal and then work backwards. So, for example, if I'm using Frere Jacques and I'm trying to get them to be able to do that improvisation activity at the end of several lessons, um, and I should probably mention that these are segments, not entire lessons. So this is a 5 to 7 minute
great point.
activity within your entire music lesson. I'm not
Hmm.
spending a whole lesson on any of these
Yes.
activities. Okay. So if my goal is to be able to get them to do that improvisation activity, then from the very, backing way up, we're going to learn the song. And then I'm going to look at, okay, what are the little tiny pieces of the end result that they need to be able to do separately. Okay, so for the end result of that improvisation activity, they need to be able to sing the song independently just as it is. They need to be able to maintain a tonal center, like I've talked about, and they need to be able to do some sort of planning. Although improvisation is on the spot, I think there is room for some immediate planning right before it comes out of your mouth, right? So I'm going to pull all of those elements out and have a lesson segment on each of those elements separately, or even just a step within a lesson segment, right? So I'm going to create some sort of activity where they're singing that song on their own. Maybe the class is singing the first part and one student sings the echo, or maybe the class plays the first part on the xylophones and one person is singing the echo, just to give them some practice with how that feels to sing independently. Then from there, I would go, okay, then another thing they need to do is um, be able to work within a certain tone set. So we'll do some activities at maybe a tone ladder where I can point to do, re, and mi and have them sing that and make sure that they can do that before I move them to the next step. So I think just in general, I'm using that activity as an example, but in general, just taking your end piece and pulling out all of the tiny little things and then just sequencing them in an order that makes sense for your learners.
Beautiful. I love that. Mandy, as we're wrapping up here, I've been thinking through some just very tactile, like rapid fire best practice questions. So you can go into as much detail as you want here, but let's go
Okay.
through um, some of the more granular things that we all, I'm putting my hand in the air, that we all trip over, or we all can trip over when it comes to cooperative learning. So how do you decide how many students will be in a group? What's your decision making process?
Sure. Well, that is based on the type of structure that you're building, and most of the time, the structure is going to dictate the number of students involved. But again, going back to that positive interdependence and equal participation, there needs to be the same number of learners as there are roles, and
Mm,
there needs to be a mechanism for each student to do each role at some point.
great. How do you decide who is going to choose the groups? I know you talked about this a little bit already, but anything else along that decision?
Um, so I might mention also, I said that with my younger groups, a lot of times I will be the one choosing for them, and that is a lot of it just has to do with time management because younger kids take a long time to make groups.
Yes.
But I will often ask the classroom teachers where they're putting kids. They put kids in small groups all the time, and a lot of my classroom teachers have shared. They'll have them on like a Google Doc and it changes every now and then. And so
Mm-hmm.
I just asked them at the beginning of the year, hey, can you share your grouping document with me? And then I can go in and like, it's the same kids they're working with in their core classroom. And some of them I can say, if it's a teacher who's using Kagan strategies often, I can tell them, okay, get in your Kagan group. And those kids know
Mm-hmm.
where to go. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. So being in an interconnected group ourselves as
Hmm.
educators helps
Yes.
it, and on that level down with
Yeah, you
students.
don't have to do all the work yourself. And if someone's already structuring their class that way, then it can be helpful to structure your class in a similar way to carry on some of that continuity through their school day. Yeah.
Mm, great. When students are working cooperatively, how do you help them stay on task?
First, I think it's important that they know what the task is. So I always verbalize the task, but I will also, while they're, if it's something where I'm not facilitating it step by step and telling them, okay, here's the next step, here's the next one, the instructions are displayed somewhere in my classroom on my whiteboard on my smartboard, and when I display them, I will display them in words, and if it's something that I can put some sort of other visual representation, I have found that to be helpful. Just because there's all kinds of different reading levels in your room, and some kids just are more drawn to those icons. So I'll have an iconic representation and words, and then I also verbalize it. I have also found radial timers to be really helpful. So
Mm,
that is a timer that instead of having the numbers count down, you're usually in circles, but there's all kinds of timers like that on YouTube. But the ones I use are the circles, and the circles, there's like a ring of different sizes inside of each other, and the circles will disappear as the time goes off. I have found that if the kids can see the numbers, a lot of times that can be stressful. They see that number ticking down, but the circles disappearing is less stressful to them. And
yeah.
it'll also keep you out of that weird thing where kids don't really understand that if it's 1 minute and some seconds left, that the one has to become
Yes,
a zero and then continue counting. Yeah.
I'm with
So
you.
radial timers.
Great. That's a
Yeah.
great tip. In a situation where students finish early, what do you do? Or what do they do?
Um, yeah, so a lot of times the structure will be a continuous one. So if we're working, if I'm putting 4 minutes on the board, you're going to work for 4 minutes and you just keep
Mm-hmm.
going back and forth until the time is up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are occasionally, like if we're doing some sort of composition activity,
Mm-hmm.
okay, our composition is complete. You could connect them with another group and have them switch, and then they're doing, they're reading each other's. You could have them, okay, can you add some detail to it by adding instruments to it? Can you, grab some non-pitch percussion and let them play with that and experiment and see what happens with that? Um, but I guess having some kind of extension in your head as the teacher, but most often I think these structures are placed in a way where they just keep going until the time is up.
Right, right.
Yeah.
If we were to get really, really excited about this and we are ready for in August, we're going to start off strong with like a really intentional, I'm going to do everything that Mandy says. I'm all on board. I love this. What are some very simple structures that we can help our youngest learners? Let's take
Mhm.
your advice that we want to do this from the
Sure.
ground up. In August, what can we do with our kindergarten students
Yeah.
to help them facilitate these skills?
Sure. So with at the very beginning of the year, I think we're really, especially in kindergarten, focusing on how we work as a social structure. So you can layer on um, cooperative structures that enhance those types of activities. So I'm thinking about things like turn. I'm sorry. What is it called? Hang on. Time. Sorry. There's one called Time Pair Share that
Mm,
again was is developed for a core classroom, but it can be used in a music classroom, no problem. So time pair share is kind of like a turn pair share, but the timing element is there to help the kids. Um, it helps some kids to keep things concise. So your kids that are like ready to share everything. And then you can imagine those kindergartners at the beginning of the year that are like, I'm not saying a word. I'm
yep.
just going to be here. But in time pair share, the student has to speak for the amount of time given. And you can start with really short amounts of time, like you turn toward your partner and you have to talk about, you know, whatever your structure is. What was, a lot of times I use it as a reflection at the end of a class. What
Mm,
was just something really easy that you can't get wrong, right? What was your favorite song from music class today? Turn and talk, and student A has to talk for 5 seconds.
mm-hmm.
But you can't talk for 3 and you can't talk for 7. It has to be exactly 5,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that pulls a little bit on some beginning of the year kindergartners, and it puts a barrier on
Yep.
others.
Yeah. That's a great activity. Yes. And especially beautiful to use at the beginning of the year. That's fabulous. Great. Mandy, wrapping up here, is there anything else that we should have in the back of our minds as we go forth and cooperate in our classrooms? Anything else that we haven't covered today and we should cover? We haven't touched on today and we should touch on.
No, I think you were very thorough. I think I would reiterate that the sequencing piece leading to a structure is really important. Not to try to just jump in on the first day with something in full force. Just you have to take the little baby steps to lead into it so that it can be successful on the first try. And then not to give up. There are, you know, endless amounts of ways that you can create these and tie them into the repertoire that you're already using in your classroom, and just give it a little extra little extra spark and pizzazz.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So making sure that we're sequencing. And the nice thing, Mandy, as well, is if we have sequenced an activity appropriately, that's actually, even though on the front end it might feel kind of daunting to some people listening, in actuality, once you sequence an activity, you've done like 6 weeks worth of lesson planning, right? It's actually
Yeah,
much
yeah.
easier to think how you're going to back up as opposed
Hmm.
to how you're just going to like throw everything, at
Right.
students in one lesson.
Yes, it's helpful for long-term planning. Um, I always, when I'm talking to teachers about lesson planning, I tell them I very, very rarely just plan a single lesson from top to bottom.
Right.
I'm often looking at a set of 5 or 6 lessons at a time, and that's one way that is helpful for me to be able to place that sequenced set of activities
Hmm.
within several different daily lessons.
Yes, yes, you have this thread here, you have that thread there, and then you're just looking at where it all lines up vertically for your one lesson. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Mandy, you mentioned sequencing. You've been talking about lesson planning. So, can you tell everybody where we can find you? Maybe this is a good time for you to plug Kodaly levels or anything else that you want us to, be encouraged to go find more about.
Sure. So I'll be returning to the faculty of the West Texas Kodaly Initiative this summer. We'll be in Lubbock, Texas, June 10th through 21st. Our faculty includes Dr. Susan Brumfield. She's our academic director. Dr. Kurt Zareski is our program director and is also on the pedagogy team. Dr. Rachel Gibson and Dr. Jill Trinka teach our music literature. We're joined by Chris Olson for special topics, and Gary Packwood is going to be doing our choir and conducting this summer. And our musicianship team includes Dr. Andy Paney and Dr. Nikkei St. Clair as well. It's just the best time in the best facility. So we hope that you will join us.
Yeah, and if someone is listening, and depending on when this comes out, if it's too late, for them to jump in, this is a beautiful opportunity that it will exist next summer
Yes,
as well. So
yes.
there's
And
always a chance.
about the same time of year every summer. So mid to late June is when that usually happens. And yeah, come on any year. We'd love to have
Great.
you.
Excellent. Mandy, thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolute delight. I have learned a lot from you, and you've been very generous with everything that you've shared, and certainly generous with everything that you share with all of the other music teachers that you work with. So I'm just so appreciative of your time and how much you are influencing this space, specifically in the area of cooperative learning. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a delight.